Good morning. Je m'appelle Ratna Omidvar. Je suis sénatrice de l'Ontario, and I am the chair of the Senate Standing Committee on Social Affairs, Science and Technology. 50 years ago, Canada had an urgent need for labor. The federal government acted. It introduced a stopgap measure to allow employers to bring foreign workers to Canada on a temporary basis, to fill jobs for which qualified Canadians were not available. It worked. In fact, it worked a bit too well. Canada became independent and, as Minister Miller has said, somewhat addicted on the source of labor and temporary foreign worker program, which now remains an essential source of workers for employers. But Canada's dependence on foreign labor has not engendered a corresponding sense of responsibility or accountability on our part. Foreign workers must navigate a confounding bureaucracy to get here. When they arrive, they lack basic protections that many Canadians enjoy. Meanwhile, our own employers are ill-served. They have their own bureaucratic battles to wage, to the point that the workers they need may arrive too late to help, too late for the harvest or too late for the fish catch. What we have, in short, is a system that serves no one. A system that staggers through inertia and the 50 years of habit. It's time for change. It's time, again, for the federal government to act, and to act now. And that is why we are here with you today. With me are Senator Gigi Osler and Senator Cormier. Our committee began studying Canada's temporary and migrant labor force in November 2022. Today, we are releasing our findings and recommendations on our report. Act Now, Solutions for Temporary and Migrant Labor in Canada. While we initially focused on the temporary foreign worker program, the evidence we heard led us to the very essence of immigrant labor infrastructure in Canada. And when we undertook a fact-finding mission to New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, we got a vivid first-hand understanding of the working and living environments of migrant workers and how they contribute to local industries, economies, and communities. And so this is, after all, a study about people. So while we can make a cold business case that migrant workers are essential economic engines, we cannot overlook how they also enrich the fabric of our local communities. Over the next few minutes, I will outline some of the structural issues we have identified and our top recommendation to address them. Senator Osler will speak about the challenges migrant workers face, as well as successes. And you'll hear how some of them have found new homes in the communities they have adopted, who have welcomed them with open arms. And Senator Cormier will then provide some remarks in French before we take questions from you. We only have 6 recommendations. Our top recommendation is for the federal government to establish a migrant worker commission, an independent, arm's-length agency to coordinate policy and respond to employers and migrant workers and make recommendations for reform to the government. The administration of migrant labor involves a number of federal departments, provincial and/or territorial governments, and municipalities with competing and overlapping interests. For example, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is a federal program, but labor is largely a question of provincial jurisdictions, and many supporting programs are run by municipalities. As one witness told us, there is no coordination or collaboration between health, legal, settlement services, and employment. He went on to say, everyone has their own policies, and they are governed by different jurisdictions. As we observe in the report, migrant workers get lost in the middle. As well, by law, all workers are entitled to certain health, safety, and labor standards in the workplace. But with all the red tape and bureaucracy surrounding immigration labor, not one witness could identify a particular organization or body responsible for ensuring that these standards are being met. This is an alphabet soup of departments, agencies, and organizations sending inspectors and inspections of one kind or another to enforce various compliance and enforcement regimes. And again, there is no coordination. We heard, as a result, that there are numerous redundant inspections taking place. As well as being inefficient, it is also frustrating for employers who must use scarce work time to produce the same information for different inspectors. With so many cooks in the kitchen, it is only logical to have a head chef. This is what we expect the federal government to do. Our recommendation to create a migrant work commission would bring order to the chaotic, wasteful, and ineffective status quo. This commission would serve as a one-stop shop for migrants and employers who need help in inserting their rights, and for employers seeking support in navigating the labyrinth of red tape, and even for government departments seeking to make their operations more efficient. By demanding more than another 50 years of reactive, short-term fixes, we can address the shortcomings of a system that is confusing for users and costly to taxpayers. We have everything to gain and much to lose if we do not act now. Thank you very much. I now invite Senator Osler to speak.
Thank you, Senator. By now, you have a good sense of the structural issues that Senator Omidvar has talked about. But as she has pointed out, ultimately this is an issue about people from other countries seeking out opportunities in Canada, and about people in Canada whose livelihood increasingly depends on the federal government heeding the title of our report, Act Now. Imagine this. You've managed to navigate the labyrinth and come to Canada for work, but your employer is mistreating you. Your work conditions aren't safe. You're not getting the money you are supposed to be paid. There is bullying and abuse, and you can't do anything about it. Why? Because your work permit is employer-specific, and you are afraid that if you complain or quit, you will have to leave the country. Employer-specific work programs employer-specific work permits leave migrant workers uniquely vulnerable. One witness even likened the situation to that of indentured servants in the past, workers who were required to labor for their employer for a set period before they would regain their freedom to live and work elsewhere. But what about those inspections that Senator Omidvar talked about? Surely they provide some measure of protection to workers. Perhaps, but we heard that inspections are often announced to employers in advance, which gives unscrupulous employers an opportunity to prepare. We heard testimony of inspectors being shown around modern employee lodgings with nice amenities, while the real lodgings remained unseen and uninspected. An employee at an abusive workplace told us point blank that she had been sent home before an inspection. When it was over, she went back to work and her abuse continued. It won't surprise you to learn that female workers are particularly vulnerable to physical and sexual assault. And they are often scared to report this violence because it could mean getting fired and deported. Which is why we are recommending a migrant work commission, which could provide a safe place for workers to turn when they have problems. Another recommendation is that the federal government explore alternatives to employer-specific work permits. Sector or region-specific work permits are alternatives worth considering because they would enable employees to leave abusive situations and benefit employers by giving them the flexibility to deploy workers where needed. It's important to note that squalid conditions are by no means the norm. And while there are certainly unscrupulous employers, most are hardworking, honest, and genuinely appreciative of the people who support them. During our fact-finding mission to New Brunswick and Prince Edward Island, we met with some of the workers and employers doing crucial work in sectors like aquaculture, agriculture, and food production. We heard that many businesses simply would not be operational without migrant labor. And we heard about the positive, transformational effect of migrant labor on entire communities. We heard about how many employers have been sponsoring migrant workers for permanent residency to give more flexibility around wages, skill level, training, and place of work. Things that benefit both employers and employees. The first significant wave of migrant workers arrived in New Brunswick and PEI about 15 years ago. We learned that they are now part of multi-generational families that have revitalized rural communities, schools, churches, and businesses. Their presence enriches everybody. So let's build a system worthy of their contributions to Canada, one that works for employers and employees alike. By exploring alternatives to employer-specific work permits and setting up a strong migrant work commission to implement long-needed reforms, we can create a system that is in the best interests of everyone. But we must act and act now. Thank you. Merci, Miigwech and Senator Cormier. Je vous invite à prendre la parole.
Merci, sénatrice Osler. Et merci à vous d'être ici aujourd'hui. Alors, vous me permettrez de reprendre en français certaines des informations clés qui ont été transmises par mes collègues. Effectivement, il y a 50 ans, le Canada avait un urgent besoin de main-d'œuvre. Le gouvernement fédéral avait donc mis en place une mesure provisoire permettant aux employeurs de faire venir des travailleurs étrangers au Canada à titre temporaire afin de pourvoir les postes pour lesquels ils ne trouvaient pas de Canadiens qualifiés. Effectivement, le programme a été victime de son succès. Le Canada est devenu dépendant de cette main-d'œuvre et le programme des travailleurs étrangers temporaires reste une source essentielle de travailleurs. Pour cette dépendance, mais cette dépendance n'a pas pour autant suscité chez nous un sentiment de responsabilité et de reconnaissance. Les travailleurs étrangers doivent se frayer un chemin dans la bureaucratie déroutante pour arriver jusqu'ici. Et lorsqu'ils arrivent, ils ne peuvent bénéficier des protections de base dont disposent tous les Canadiens. Pendant ce temps, nos employeurs sont de plus en plus mal servis par l'État. Ils doivent mener leur propre bataille bureaucratique au risque de voir les travailleurs dont ils ont besoin arriver trop tard pour leur être utiles. En résumé, nous avons affaire à un système qui ne sert personne, un système sclérosé maintenu par la force de l'inertie et de 50 ans d'habitude. Il est temps que ça change. Le gouvernement fédéral doit passer à l'action et agir maintenant. Notre comité étudie la question de la main-d'œuvre temporaire et migrante au Canada depuis novembre 2022. Aujourd'hui, nous publions nos conclusions et nos recommandations dans notre rapport intitulé « Agissons maintenant des solutions pour la main-d'œuvre temporaire et migrante au Canada ». Au départ, notre étude était axée sur le programme des travailleurs étrangers temporaires et nos recommandations vont dans ce sens. Mais les témoignages que nous avons entendus nous ont amenés à nous pencher sur l'essence même de l'infrastructure de la main-d'œuvre migrante au Canada. Lorsque nous avons effectué une mission d'étude au Nouveau-Brunswick et à l'île de Prince-Édouard, nous avons pu nous faire une idée précise des conditions de travail et de vie des travailleurs migrants. Nous avons constaté à quel point leurs contributions aux industries, aux économies et aux communautés locales sont importantes. Il s'agit, après tout, comme l'a précisé la sénatrice Omidvar, d'une étude portant sur des personnes. Au cours de la mission d'étude dans ma province, le Nouveau-Brunswick, nous avons rencontré quelques-uns des 60 000 titulaires d'un permis de travail étranger temporaire. Ils nous ont fait part des difficultés auxquelles ils sont confrontés, les formalités administratives excessives, la vulnérabilité et parfois même les préjugés. Cela dit, ils nous ont aussi montré la contribution qu'ils apportent, non seulement dans le cadre de leur travail, mais aussi au sein des communautés. Comme vous le savez, les communautés de langue française en situation minoritaire au Nouveau-Brunswick ont connu un déclin démographique au cours des dernières décennies. Toutefois, les travailleurs qui ont choisi de s'établir au Canada pour de bon contribuent à la revitalisation de ces communautés. Nous avons appris que la première génération d'enfants d'anciens travailleurs étrangers temporaires brille maintenant dans les écoles de langue française et contribue à la langue et à la culture. Ils sont fort bienvenus dans leur communauté. Et nous avons encore besoin d'eux. La région de l'Atlantique doit retenir entre 18 000 et 22 000 immigrants par an pour répondre aux besoins prévus du marché du travail. Les employeurs des secteurs de l'agriculture, du tourisme et de la transformation des fruits de mer ne sauraient être plus clairs, et je cite l'un d'entre eux, « Sans programme nous permettant d'embaucher des étrangers, notre entreprise n'est pas mieux que morte », a déclaré un employeur, et un autre a ajouté « Sans main-d'œuvre étrangère, je devrais fermer demain matin, ça ne vaudrait même pas la peine d'essayer ». Il est donc grand temps de mettre en place un système de travail migrant qui fonctionne pour tout le monde. Pour ce faire, nous préconisons que le gouvernement fédéral crée une commission sur le travail migrant dirigée par un commissaire ayant le pouvoir et les ressources nécessaires pour entreprendre les réformes qui s'imposent. L'administration du travail migrant est extrêmement complexe. Différents aspects sont gérés par un certain nombre de ministères fédéraux, par les gouvernements provinciaux ou territoriaux et par les municipalités, sans compter qu'un solide leadership est nécessaire pour remédier au chaos, au gaspillage et à l'inefficacité qui caractérise le statu quo. Notre comité envisage donc une commission qui servirait de guichet unique aux migrants ayant besoin d'aide pour faire valoir leurs droits, aux employeurs cherchant à s'orienter dans le dédale bureaucratique et aux ministères qui souhaitent rationaliser leurs activités. Les travailleurs migrants cultivent et transforment nos aliments. Ils soutiennent l'industrie touristique. Ils prennent soin de nos aînés. Tout le monde au Canada bénéficie d'une manière ou d'une autre de leur dur labeur. Après 50 ans de demi-mesures et de dédale bureaucratique, il est temps de mettre en place une solution durable. Je vous remercie. Nous vous ferons maintenant un plaisir de répondre à vos questions. Merci.
Merci. Thank you. On va maintenant procéder à la période de questions. Je ne vois pas de questions dans la salle, donc nous allons tout de suite passer sur Zoom. So, if you're attending on Zoom, please use the raise hand function at this moment so I can hand you over the mic. First off, Adam Huras from New Brunswick Telegraph. You have the floor.
Hi there. Thanks for questions. The federal government announced earlier this year that it plans to shrink the proportion of temporary residents allowed in the country. I wanted your take on that and whether it impacts, I guess, what you found and whether you think it's a good idea to shrink those numbers if they've grown too fast for Canada to keep up, or if that's needed, like you heard from industry, how it's kind of the lifeblood of several jobs in New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada.
Thank you for that question. I think Senator Cormier from New Brunswick will add to my answer. We have asked for the federal government to provide temporary residence in the annual immigration plan. Part of the problem is that that the numbers of temporary foreign workers have crept up on us without responsibility, without any accountability or transparency. So let's get a number and let's see how that works. That's a good first step, I believe, that the federal government should take. Restricting the number of temporary residents, whether they are workers or with a closed work permit or not, will have consequences. And this is the kind of knee-jerk reaction that this committee does not support. We want, for the first time in this context, a planned approach to meeting the needs of our labor market, meeting the needs of the temporary foreign workers. I have always maintained Canada must and should be able to walk and chew gum at the same time, and we've laid out a plan to do so.
Et si je peux rajouter, j'espère que vous avez l'interprétation là, Monsieur Horace. Alors si je peux rajouter, vous le savez comme moi, le Nouveau-Brunswick a un besoin immense en ressources humaines dans tous les secteurs de notre société. Nous avons également des défis démographiques sur le plan de la francophonie, mais pas uniquement. Donc l'idée de restreindre le nombre de travailleurs temporaires est pour nous pas la solution. En fait, au-delà des défis de logement, je pense qu'il faut qu'il y ait une stratégie très, très claire pour accroître et permettre à nos industries, à nos entreprises, à nos communautés de pouvoir accueillir décemment des travailleurs temporaires étrangers qui viendront contribuer à l'essor de notre province et de notre pays.
Follow-up, Adam?
And if I can add just one short answer to that very good question. We were told that the Atlantic region needs to retain 18,000 to 22,000 immigrants per year to meet projected labor market needs by 2030. And so that's a very intuitive, important question. And that's why we feel this report is so important, because it is about showing leadership. It is about being strategic and not simply reactive.
Thanks. Just a quick follow-up as well. The committee heard some disturbing testimony from temporary foreign workers, and I reported on it. Those workers, get worker abuses from those working in New Brunswick and Atlantic Canada and elsewhere. I wanted to know, the report really, I haven't had a lot of time to go over, it's 152 pages, but I don't see much on sanctions and whether they're enough. I know there was 4 New Brunswick companies fined last year. I just wonder if you find the disciplinary action enough to keep people in line.
Thank you for that question. We did hear, when we went on our study trip, from employers and from workers about the bad apples. Let me characterize them this way. Nobody wants bad apples in the crop. And employers, as well as migrant workers, told us that the bad employers, the ones who have been disciplined more than 1, 2, or 3 times, should in fact be removed from their capacity to hire foreign workers. That is not yet the case. Employers who are not up to the standard often are able to demonstrate that they are and then get back into the mix. And I believe this is exactly the kind of problem that the Migrant Work Commission could resolve, because there would be a commissioner for employers on the commission, there would be a commissioner for migrant workers on the commission, and there would be federal and provincial and other government employees on this commission. And they could visualize a new process that incents good employers and removes bad ones from the basket.
Et si je peux rajouter, M. Horace, également, évidemment, on a entendu parler de ces entrepreneurs qui étaient, comme l'a dit la sénatrice, de mauvaises pommes dans le panier, mais nous avons également entendu parler des employeurs qui sont des employeurs consciencieux, qui sont des employeurs préoccupés par le bien-être de leurs employés. Et ça aussi, on l'a entendu durant notre mission au Nouveau-Brunswick et à l'île du Prince-Édouard. Donc, pour nous, et ce rapport témoigne de ça, de cet équilibre entre évidemment les défis que rencontrent les travailleurs quand ils sont embauchés par des employeurs qui ne sont pas tout à fait justes dans la manière de les traiter, et ces employeurs qui sont nombreux et qui offrent un service et qui offrent des conditions de travail adéquates aux travailleurs. Mais tout cela, évidemment, sera amélioré si cette commission est créée.
Thank you. Merci. Next up, Diana Martin, Farmtario, Glacier Farm Media. You have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you for making the time for questions. I appreciate the previous answers, but in Ontario at least, we've had a number of challenges when it comes to migrant workers finding justice, and the operators who are the bad apples still being able to access programs that make temporary foreign workers available to them. We've also had different governments, whether municipal or federal, say that they're going to clamp down on these, but we've yet to see any real banning, I guess, of those bad apples from accessing temporary foreign workers, or solid results from this. Do you think that this will change that? Do you think this will provide the changes required? Because currently we've had different announcements that say it will happen, but we've yet to see it.
We believe very firmly that the creation of a migrant work commission could get to the heart of all these very troublesome questions. No Canadian wants to determine that the product that they are consuming is tainted by a labor chain that is exploited in any way. The federal government does have a budget, does have some interesting items in it. One would be the creation of a program for seafood processors. But in your case in Ontario, I believe that we've made a recommendation that the funding for migrant worker aid should be increased. It was $4 million or $2 million. I noticed in the budget that it has been increased to $22 million because migrant workers are not eligible for settlement support. They have to have another place where they can talk to for advice, whether it's legal, whether it's health, whether it's settlement. And the creation of these NGOs throughout Ontario, for instance, with clear access to them, would provide a route to some kind of justice. In addition, I personally quite I'm attracted to the idea that the federal government has floated about trusted employers who have time and time and time again proven that they are able to provide decent work for their workers. Maybe they should be given preference over others. But again, we have a host of ideas. We have to come to a centralized approach to implement some of these proposals through the Migrant Work Commission.
And if I can add, and thank you for the question, what you've asked is consistent with what we heard from employers and from employees, that compliance and enforcing compliance is an issue. At times, workers did not know who to turn to. And even employers were not sure which regulations would fall to them. Does this apply to them? And so it's clear the status quo isn't working. And hence, one of our top recommendation is a Migrant Work Commission, where you would have a commissioner for migrant workers, a commissioner for employers, and representation from the government, so a tripartite commission. Because what is in place right now is 50 years of piecemeal changes, reactive knee-jerk strategies that isn't working and allowing bad apples to fall through the cracks, as well as people to continue to suffer abuses.
For a follow-up, thank you so much for your answers. For a follow-up, we've noticed a change, an announcement here for WSIB to acknowledge some claims retroactively and moving forward for temporary foreign workers. Sometimes the challenge, I know we kind of use temporary foreign worker as an umbrella term, but sometimes the challenge is the temporary foreign worker foreign program compared to the SOP program. No, there isn't a unified coverage there. There'll be some migrant workers that are able to apply for certain benefits where other migrant workers are unable to do so. I'm sorry, I did not get a copy of the report myself because this was a little bit sudden for me. Is there anything that will encourage a more blanket approach and not define workers, temporary foreign workers, by the program they're in, but rather that they are temporary foreign workers, period? And although these are all recommendations, what do you think the uptake will be? Are you positive that this will, feeling optimistic that this will go forward and be initiated in good time?
There is a section in the report that speaks to the patchwork of healthcare services, which is maybe not dissimilar to the patchwork of worker protections under WSIB. We didn't specifically address WIC in our report. But in the healthcare section, we recommend that there is a good proxy for the federal government to step in through the interim federal health care program if the provincial government or the employer are not able to confirm health care for the employee on arrival. So that could be a proxy. On your question of do we think there will be uptake, the Minister of Immigration and the Minister of Employment Social Development Canada is required to respond to this report within 100 or 120 days. But we don't intend, this committee does not intend to wait that long. We will be asking for meetings, asking for responses in a more direct and formal manner as opposed to just waiting for the report. We have a number of recommendations that are timely and that are imperative. First, the establishment of a migrant worker commission. Second, the phasing out of employer-specific work permits to region or sector-wide. Third, to expanding the provincial nominee programs in places like New Brunswick, for instance, so that more temporary foreign workers can use that path. I must tell you, we saw a number of employers in PEI and New Brunswick who had used that path to sponsor their employees. And it was such a good news story for us to see the employer and the employee come to, to the end of their journey. But we also saw how so many employees are not willing to speak out for fear of jeopardizing their pathway to permanency. This is not a good outcome for us to have. We have to normalize that through creating pathways and clarifying pathways to permanency for those who wish to stay in Canada. And by the way, we also heard that not everybody wishes to stay in Canada, that some, in fact, are quite happy coming here, working for a certain month of time, and going back to their families for the winter. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Thank you. Merci. I see no other questions on Zoom, though it's not too late. You can still use the raise hand function at this time if you have an extra question. Je vais utiliser mon privilège d'animateur de la conférence de presse pour vous poser une question, sénateur Cormier, Boris Proulx, Le Devoir. Une des recommandations que je peux lire, c'est éliminer progressivement le permis de travail lié à un employeur donné. Est-ce que vos travaux ont montré que c'est la première fois que c'est recommandé au Canada? Et pourquoi est-ce que ça dure encore à ce jour, là, les permis de travail barrés à un employeur?
Si mes collègues peuvent aussi répondre à cette question, mais il est clair que un des grands défis que les travailleurs rencontrent, c'est les permis fermés, les permis de travail fermés, qui font en sorte qu'ils sont liés à un seul employeur. Alors si les employeurs en question ne les traitent pas bien, ils sont quand même pris, je dirais, avec ces employeurs-là. Donc, il est clair que le constat que nous avons fait et ce que nous avons entendu, c'est qu'il est nécessaire que la capacité pour des travailleurs d'obtenir des permis ouverts qui leur permettent aussi de changer d'employeur fait partie de la solution. Ce que nous avons aussi entendu des employeurs par rapport à ces permis ouverts, c'est l'importance, par exemple, on l'a mentionné, de stratégies régionales ou par secteur. En fait, en d'autres mots, dans un secteur donné, un employé qui travaille dans une entreprise donnée pourrait, avec un permis ouvert, transférer dans le même secteur, dans une autre entreprise, parce qu'évidemment, il y a des stratégies économiques qui vont par secteur ou par région selon les spécificités. Donc, c'est au cœur, cette question de permis fermé, permis ouvert est au cœur des défis, est au cœur des recommandations que nous avons faites.
And perhaps for other senators, this is the first time in Canada this idea has been brought forward.
The idea of a sector-specific
closed permit, to get rid of the closed work permit for migrant workers.
No. Many of the advocates who appeared before us called for an end of the closed work permit, called for immediate permanency on landing. We have taken another route, a more what we would say a reasonable route, that employer-specific permits need to be phased out over 3 years. Phasing them out immediately would be a very rude shock to the system, and we need to plan. We need to be strategic. We need to be thoughtful, as opposed to making a decision today and disturbing the ecosystem. It is an ecosystem that exists together, and we heard from many, many employers that if they did not have access to temporary foreign workers, their business would close down. That doesn't mean that employers should be free to abuse their employers simply because they are foreign. But the kinds of recommendations that we have put out create a pathway to doing both things, meeting our labor market demands and treating workers fairly with respect and dignity.
But if I may ask, just one in a nutshell, how do you explain that this system is still on? The system of closed work permit for migrant workers. How come the government didn't get rid of it in the past?
That's an excellent question. I would imagine an answer to that is power. There is a power imbalance here. Employers have powerful lobby groups, and they are in Ottawa a great deal, and workers do not, which is why we come back to the Migrant Worker Commission with a commissioner dedicated to the migrant workers themselves, migrant workers would have direct access to the commissioner to provide the Migrant Worker Commissioner with their proposals for reform.
Et si je peux rajouter... Oh, allez-y. C'est nécessaire.
And if I can add sort of a broader perspective, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program is over 50 years old, so created in 1973. And I'm going to actually read the first paragraph from our executive summary. It was created as a last and limited resort to allow employers to bring foreign workers to Canada on a temporary basis to fill jobs for which qualified Canadians are not available. 50 years later, the TFW program has become a central and essential, my addition, component of the labour market in Canada in multiple sectors. The market has changed. Jobs have changed. Sectors have changed. The program has had, over the last 50 years, piecemeal changes, programs added here, tweaks there, but there has not been an overarching look at the program, combined, integrated with labor markets, with immigration. That's what the report really is calling for. We really are looking at a modernization of the program, integrating it better into immigration numbers, looking holistically at the contributions of the workers to Canada, the benefit to employers, to communities, and how can we modernize it and not continue to go with what was in place in 1973. Senator Cormier?
Simplement rajouter qu'en fait, ce qu'on a entendu aussi, c'est que effectivement, le marché a changé, les besoins dans les régions et les besoins des secteurs ont évolué. Et que donc, les stratégies d'immigration, en ce qui concerne les travailleurs temporaires, ne sont pas aujourd'hui bien adaptées aux réalités régionales. One size fits all ne fonctionne plus, on en est conscient. Donc, comment le gouvernement fédéral, comment, à travers cette commission, on pourrait aider le gouvernement fédéral à tenir mieux compte, en fait, des réalités des régions et des besoins. On l'a entendu au Nouveau-Brunswick, dans ma province, on l'a entendu également à l'île du Prince-Édouard. Donc, les travailleurs et les employeurs réclament, en fait, des stratégies qui tiennent davantage compte de l'évolution de leur communauté. Et je terminerai en disant que la présence d'immigrants temporaires dans nos régions, et je pense notamment aux régions acadiennes du Nouveau-Brunswick et de l'île du Prince-Édouard, ce n'est pas la panacée à tous les défis que nous rencontrons en démographie, mais c'est un enjeu important et c'est une contribution fort importante que d'avoir ces travailleurs migrants temporaires dans nos provinces et de savoir qu'il y a également des organismes dans ces provinces, au-delà des entrepreneurs, des organismes qui les aident aussi à s'intégrer, à connaître leurs droits. Tout cela fait partie de l'écosystème.
Merci, thank you. I see no other questions online, so this puts an end to this press conference. Merci beaucoup.
Well done, Gigi.
Mm-hmm.